He grabbed the rifle from her hands and slammed it onto the concrete floor. The crack of old wood echoed across the entire armory. "Take your daddy's relic back to a museum," he said, loud enough for every man in the room to hear. "This is a SEAL competition, not a history class." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. She looked down at her father's rifle, the rifle that had survived a burning building in Fallujah, that had outlasted a war, that had been carried home and cleaned every single morning for 14 years by a man who never told anyone what he'd done with it, now lying on concrete, scratched, humiliated. Then she looked up at him and smiled. Smile terrified him more than anything he had ever seen in combat. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her father had kept 17 men alive with that rifle, and the medal he earned for it had been buried, on purpose, by the same kind of men who were now stealing her ammunition in the dark, sabotaging her scope, erasing her name from the schedule. They thought a broken rifle and an old set of iron sights would be enough to break her. They were about to learn what 20 years of Montana mornings had built, and what a dead man's voice still says every time she breathes out. They heard her before they saw her, not because she was loud, she wasn't, not because she announced herself, she never did. They heard her because 40 men standing on a California tarmac in the kind of heat that rises from concrete and finds you from below went quiet at exactly the same moment, and silence from 40 elite operators is its own kind of sound. The bus pulled into Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake at 6:43 in the morning. Captain Sarah Callum was the last one off, not because she was slow, because she had learned, the hard way, the only way anything worth learning ever gets learned, that the way you enter a room tells people everything they need to know about whether you're afraid of them. She wasn't. She stepped down onto the tarmac with her duffel over one shoulder and her father's rifle case tucked under her left arm like it weighed nothing. It weighed more than most people realized. Not in pounds, in years. In a November in Fallujah that nobody on this parking lot knew about. In a man who came home from that November and never once talked about what he'd done there. In 20 years of Montana mornings that started before the sun and ended after the frost had burned off the grass and the rifle had been cleaned and put away, and the lessons had been absorbed so completely. They stopped being lessons and started being the structure of a person. The heat hit her immediately. California desert heat. The relentless kind, the honest kind. Sarah had grown up in Montana where the cold had the same character. No apology, no negotiation, just the thing itself arriving and staying until it decided to leave. She respected both. What she didn't respect was what she felt the moment she cleared the bottom step. 40 pairs of eyes, not all hostile. Some genuinely curious, which was almost worse, because curiosity can turn faster than hate. She'd learned that across 3 deployments, 2 continents. One left knee that a surgeon at Kandahar had looked at in 2019 with the expression of a man about to say something he didn't enjoy saying. She'd stopped him mid-sentence. "Tell me what I can still do," she'd said. "Not what I can't," he'd blinked. Told her she'd done all of it. Her left leg was slightly different in its stride than her right. Not dramatically. Not in any way that screamed. Just different. A rhythm that was hers. Specific. Earned in a way that most of the things worth having get earned. Nobody mentioned it on the tarmac. She didn't explain it. Chief Gerald Pruitt was waiting near the check-in tables. Rangemaster. 20 years running competitions at installations across 3 time zones, which meant he had seen nearly everything and had developed the professional affect of a man who intended to keep it that way. Stocky. Sunburned. Eyes that calculated constantly without ever quite landing. Captain Callum, he didn't extend his hand. "Welcome to China Lake, Chief Pruitt. I'll need your weapon for inspection and scope assignment." She set the rifle case on the table and unlatched it without ceremony. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth the way her father had shown her before she was old enough to attend school, lay the M24. Action-worn smooth from decades of handling. Stock darkened with age and oil and the specific quality of attention that belongs to things cared for by someone who understood that care was its own form of commitment. There was a hairline crack near the pistol grip. Repaired, carefully, with wood filler and fine sandpaper and linseed oil and the patience of a man who believed, actually believed, not as a sentiment but as a working principle, that broken things were worth keeping. Pruitt looked at the rifle, then at Sarah, then back at the rifle. "This is your competition weapon." "Yes, the tournament specification." Quiet. Her father had taught her this. Speak quietly and people have to lean in. The moment someone leans in, you have their full attention. The M24 meets minimum caliber and action requirements. It qualifies. Pruitt wrote something on his clipboard. His pen moved with the energy of a man documenting things so he could say later that none of this was his idea. "Scope assignment at the armory," he said. "A4." She heard it before she got there, ladder. The kind that goes underground when you enter a room. Becomes smirks. Becomes exchanged glances. 2 junior SEAL operators near the armory window. The armory sergeant, a lean man whose face had been told what to do and wasn't proud of it, standing behind a table. On the table, her assigned scope. Sarah looked at it without speaking. The PVS 10N night vision scope was military standard in 1997. The rubber eye cup was cracked. The mounting bracket had been shimmed with folded aluminum foil. And when she held it up to the window light and looked through the glass, a fracture, interior lens, spiderweb crack that turned the entire field of view into fragments. Deliberately useless. One of the operators near the window had his hand over his mouth, not quite covering his smile. This is what they sent her. This exact thing. This is what they decided she deserved. Sarah set the scope on the table. Then, hands that moved from muscle memory rather than conscious thought, she removed the broken scope mount entirely. 3 screws, a quick rotation of the base ring. The optic came free. She set it beside the case, underneath the M24's original iron sights. Front post. Rear aperture. Simple. Honest. She heard one of the operators inhale. "Are you serious?" The other one. Not quite under his breath. Sarah picked up her rifle, checked the chamber, dry-fired once against the wall to feel the trigger break. Clean, consistent, her father's careful maintenance living in the mechanism even now, and looked at the armory sergeant. "Anything else I need to sign?" He was staring at the iron sights. "No, ma'am." "Then I'll see you at the range." She walked out into the California sun, and behind her the story was already spreading. Not through phones, service was restricted on base. Through the human channel. Person to person, the old way, the way that mattered. Her room at the far end of the barracks meant she walked past 11 other rooms to get there. 11 doors, 11 different reactions. One man went back to cleaning his rifle without acknowledgement. That was the most respectful response she received in that hallway. 1 nodded. 3 stared. 2 kept their faces carefully neutral in the way of people who had been trained to conceal contempt. She unpacked with systematic efficiency. Cot, metal locker, window facing the range. She heard the door next to hers open and close. Thin concrete walls, not barriers. The illusion of privacy, iron sights, first voice, young. "Irritated, I heard you." Second voice, older, more careful, at 1,000 yards. Come on, she scored perfect on her placement test to get here. Same as everyone else in that briefing room tomorrow. With a museum piece, Voss. The older voice, quieter. "Whatever you're planning, don't." Silence, then Voss again. Lower. The register of a man who has decided something and stopped needing to argue about it. "I'm not planning anything." He was absolutely planning something. Sarah sat on the edge of the cot. She allowed herself the small luxury of memory. Her father's hands over hers on frost-stiff Montana grass. 5 in the morning, every morning before school, for the world. Cold so complete that her breath misted in the air and the rifle barrel was almost too cold to touch. "Feel the wind before you measure it," he would say. Crouching behind her. Patient in the specific way of men is not a virtue but a tool. The rifle is honest, Sarah. Iron doesn't lie. It shows you exactly what's there. Nothing more. Nothing less. Learn to trust that. That's the whole job. She had learned it. 22 years of Montana mornings. 3 deployments. 1 knee that would never be what it was, and her father's rifle in her hands in a concrete room in California. 30 years after the first morning he put it there, she lay down on the cot, closed her eyes. Was asleep in under 4 minutes the way her father had taught her. Sleep was a weapon like any other. Use as much as the mission required. Not a drop more. Competition briefing was held at 7 the next morning in a low ceiling room that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and old coffee. 40 competitors, folding chairs in rows. Sarah took the 3rd row and was aware, without looking around, that she was the only woman in the room. That awareness was not hers alone. It was shared by every man present, which made it a variable in the room's atmosphere whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Commander Helen Reeves stood at the front. She had designed this tournament, run it for 6 years. She was the only senior officer at this installation who had, on day 1, reviewed Sarah's application and written a single word in the margin. Approved. Sarah had read her file. What was available at her clearance level? 28 years of service, Silver Star, 2 combat commands. She moved like someone who had never stopped training and had simply stopped explaining why. She looked at the room. She did not look at Sarah differently than she looked at anyone else, which was itself unusual enough to notice. Welcome to the Senior Sniper Invitational. A pause that had weight in it. You're here because someone looked at your record and decided you were worth the cost of the plane ticket. Whether that's true is what the next 5 days will determine. She let that sit. One thing before we get into structure. This is not a technology competition. The military has competitions for technology. She looked at the room without looking at anyone specifically. She didn't need to. This is a marksmanship competition. If you can't make a shot without your equipment telling you how, you're going to struggle here. Lieutenant Commander Decker Voss was in the front row. He raised his hand with the confidence of someone who doesn't actually have a question but wants to be seen asking one. Commander, smooth. Practiced. The voice of a man who has spent years making arrogance sound like competence. The equipment list shows standard issue across competitors, but I'm seeing that at least one competitor is using non-standard optics. Iron sights specifically. There a waiver process we should be aware of? The smile in his voice was subtle. The men around him heard it perfectly. Reeves looked at Voss for a moment that lasted exactly as long as she decided it would. There is no waiver required for iron sights, she said. Iron sights are legal. Iron sights are traditional. Iron sights have won wars. A pause. Next question. Voss sat back. He didn't look at Sarah. That was deliberate. The specific contempt that refuses to grant its target the dignity of acknowledgement. Sarah looked straight ahead and noted it the same way she noted everything. Stored. To become relevant at a moment she couldn't yet predict. After the briefing, as competitors filed out, a hand touched her elbow lightly. She turned Master Sergeant Elias Drummond, black man in his mid-40s. Close-cropped gray at his temples. The kind of build that comes from decades of functional training. Shoulders, forearms that looked carved from something denser than ordinary material, movements unhurried and precise in the way of men who have learned to conserve everything. His eyes showed 22 years of service, which meant they showed very little, because men who have seen what he'd seen learned to be careful about what they let their faces broadcast. Drummond, he said. Army. Not here to say anything particular. Just figured someone should introduce themselves like a human being. Sarah shook his hand. Callum, Marines, I know. A beat. Then, carefully watching her face. Your father, Staff Sergeant Daniel Callum, Marine, Fallujah. November 2004, Sarah went still. Not visibly, not in any way the men around her would notice, but still. The kind of still that happens inside a person when something they weren't prepared for arrives without warning. How do you know that name? Drummond held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than it appeared to. Shoot well this week, he said. It matters more than you know. And he walked toward the range. Sarah stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds. Not confused, not rattled, recalibrating, with the focused speed of a woman who had learned that the most important information often arrived without context. And the worst thing you could do was demand the context before you were ready for it. She followed him out. The young ranger spotter assigned to cover multiple shooters in her section was standing near the lane markers. Early 20s, sharp eyes. The specific attentiveness of someone who had not yet learned to prejudge what he was about to see. His name was Okafor. He would be calling scores for the next 5 days. He didn't know yet what that would mean, neither did she. First qualification phase was a standard standing prone series, 20 targets, distances from 200 to 600 yards. 2 minutes per target, scored on ring value. Sarah was assigned to lane 7. Voss was in lane 6. She went prone, settled the rifle into position. Took for lengths to bring her heart rate down to where she wanted it, low and steady. The rear aperture framed the first target at 200 yards. The front post sat in the center. She breathed out slowly, felt the natural pause between exhale and the next inhale. That precise window when the body is briefly still enough to be trusted. Broke the trigger clean. She cycled and moved to the second target without checking the first. You didn't check. Either you did it right or you didn't. Looking back wouldn't change it. On her left, Voss settled into position. She heard his scope's adjustable turrets clicking. Deliberate. Expensive. Sound of a man who trusted his equipment more than himself and had spent enough to justify that trust. His first shot came 4 seconds after hers. 9. Good. Not perfect. Her third shot. 10 center. She heard someone on the observation platform exhale. Shot 4, 5, 6. Each one in the rhythm she'd maintained since she was 7 years old. Each one called at 9 or 10. Each one landing in a conversation happening on the observation deck above her. A conversation she couldn't hear but could feel in the quality of what followed each score call. Shot 12 at 400 yards. This was the one that changed the tone. 400 yards with iron sights, there is no margin for anything except perfect fundamentals. The front post is the width of a small coin at that distance. The wind had a left-to-right component. 8 miles per hour, gusting. Felt rather than measured. Sarah waited. The gust softened for exactly the window she needed, 10 center, from the observation deck. A voice saying something sharply. Then silence on lane 6. Voss had stopped shooting. She registered it the same way she registered a wind drop. His rifle had been making a rhythm of reports. Now the rhythm paused. He had noticed shot 15, 500 yards. Shot 17, 550. Shot 19, 600 yards. Wind had picked up. 12 miles per hour sustained with a crosswind that shifted every 40 seconds in a pattern she'd been cataloging since she got into position. She adjusted her hold without touching a turret, without dialing anything, using only the position of the front post relative to the target's edge, 10 center. Chief Pruitt, standing at the scoring station, a man who had spent 15 years developing the professional composure of someone who believed he had seen everything, said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then quietly, to no one in particular, Sarah fired her 20th shot, 10 center. She cleared the chamber, set the rifle safe, stood. The scoring officer walked the line. When he reached lane 7, he looked at her card for a moment longer than the others. Perfect score, he said, not announcing it, reading it, with the specific wonder of a man encountering something he'd been told wasn't supposed to happen. He moved on. Sarah looked up. Old habit. Threat assessment. Always know what's above you. Admiral Harlan Stokes was standing at the observation deck railing, 59 years old. 3 stars. The measured expression of someone who had spent a career learning not to react publicly until he'd thought privately. He was looking at her, not smiling, not frowning, looking the way a person looks at something they need time to fully understand. Then he raised his binoculars and turned back to the range. That was all. It was enough. Mess hall, Sarah carried her tray to a table near the windows, and a space opened around her the way space opens around things people aren't quite sure how to categorize. Not total isolation. Drummond sat across from her after a moment, unhurried, certain. 2 younger rangers who didn't care about the politics sat nearby. The majority of the room gave her the measured distance of men who were recalibrating. Voss sat at the center table, talking, which meant he had opinions he needed to share at volume. She caught fragments across the room. Beginner's luck, wait until the moving targets. At 600 with no wind it's different. Drummond ate without speaking. Then, he's going to be a problem. He was already a problem. Sarah didn't look up from her tray. He just didn't have a reason yet. Now he thinks he has one. There's a difference, significant difference. A problem without a reason is ambient. A problem with a reason starts making moves. She paused. That's when you find out who the people around you actually are. Drummond considered this. Your father teach you that? She held his gaze. My father taught me everything worth knowing. The rest I learned by being the only woman in rooms that didn't want me there. He nodded. Slowly, the nod of a man who understands something completely. They ate in silence. Then Sarah set down her fork. Someone went through my equipment locker last night. Drummond's fork stopped moving. Nothing taken, she said. Nothing damaged. But moved. Kind of move meant to look like it wasn't moved. She looked at him. I pack my gear in a specific sequence. The sequence was disrupted. You're sure? Not a question, I'm sure. He was quiet. Across the mess, Voss said something that made the men at his table laugh. Sarah didn't look over. I'll keep my eyes open, Drummond said finally. I know you will. She picked up her fork. That's why I told you. The afternoon qualification was a timed scenario. 12 targets, random sequence, mixed distances, each visible for 8 seconds. 1 shot per target. Missed the window. The target was gone, no recovery. This was the format that separated instinctive shooters from proficient ones. The ability to trust your first read. Not confirm it. Not second guess it. Trust it. Sarah went to lane 7. Went prone. First target appeared, 400 yards. Moving offset right. 8 seconds. Iron sights found it in the first second. Second, she read the wind, made the synthesis that happens below conscious thought when you've done it enough times. Third second, she fired, 10 center. The target disappeared. The range held its breath for the length of time it took the scoring officer to confirm. Then the call came back. Okafor said something under his breath. The tone of someone who said it before he had time to prepare a more neutral reaction. Second target. 300 yards. Center. Third. By the time she reached her 9th shot, the observation deck above her had accumulated people. She could hear more footsteps than had been there in the morning. She didn't look up. Looking up was something you did when you needed to be seen. She didn't need to be seen, she needed to shoot. 10th target. 600 yards, she breathed. Waited. Fired, the scoring officer said 10 in a voice that sounded like it had been squeezed out of a man who'd run out of reactions. 11th. 12th. The same. When the phase ended and she stood and cleared her weapon, the range had shifted. The morning silence had been surprise. This was something else entirely. This was the held breath of a room that was reordering its understanding of what it was watching. Stopped at lane 7, 12 for 12, he said. Then he looked at Sarah and said nothing else. Sometimes that was the most complete thing a person could say. On lane 6, Voss. 9 for 12. Under any other circumstances that would have led the board. Today it was second place. Sarah walked back toward the barracks, past Voss in the equipment staging area. He didn't speak. She didn't speak, but she felt the quality of his silence. Not the blank quiet of indifference, but the compressed, pressurized silence of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't expect and can't yet decide what to do about it. Father had taught her about that kind of silence too. The most dangerous moment is not when someone hates you openly. The most dangerous moment is when someone who hates you goes quiet. She found the sabotage at 2240 equipment room. Her locker standing open, not broken, opened, which meant a key, which meant someone with access to something they shouldn't have had access to. Her ammunition case sat exactly where she'd left it, but lighter. She lifted it, counted, 40 rounds missing, not all of it, enough to leave her short for 2 phases if she couldn't source a replacement, not obviously enough depleted to constitute clear evidence if she reported it. Deniable, surgical. The work of someone who understood logistics well enough to know exactly how much to take. She stood in the equipment room and felt the specific pressure rising in her chest that she had learned over many years to treat with extreme caution. Not anger exactly, the precursor to anger. The thing that builds before the valve opens, and if you let it open in the wrong direction, it floods the wrong systems. She breathed, let it settle, walked to Drummond's door and knocked. He opened it in 15 seconds, already dressed, which meant he hadn't been fully asleep, or he'd been expecting her. Possibly both, she told him. He listened without interrupting, in the way of men who are taking something seriously and not just waiting for their turn to speak. How short are you? 40 rounds. Compatible caliber in my surplus. He held up a hand. 2 minutes, she waited in the hall. He came back with a sealed ammunition box, handed it to her without ceremony. You're not going to ask me questions about this, she said. Already know the answers. She looked at him. Whoever has access to those equipment keys either did this themselves or gave someone else the ability to. Either way, I was the target, yes, and you're not suggesting I report it, not yet. 1 open locker and 40 missing rounds with no specific fingerprints. Right now you look like you're complaining. Wait until the pattern continues. You have documentation, and whoever did this will do it again because they'll think it worked. His jaw set. That you're rattled. She held his gaze, are you? The question sat in the air between them. Yes, she said, not because it was easy, because it was true. She'd learned that lying to allies costs more than it saves. Not about the ammunition. About the fact that someone on this base watched what I did today and decided sabotage was the appropriate response. A pause that had real weight in it. My father dealt with that his whole career, she said. Drummond looked at the floor. When he looked up, his expression had something in it she recognized because she had seen it in mirrors. The look of a person carrying an old, specific anger they've learned to carry quietly. My grandfather served 2 tours, he said carefully. Saved 4 men in a firefight. Know what his commanding officer wrote in his final evaluation? He stopped. Adequate under pressure. That was the word. Adequate. The hallway was very quiet. My father's Silver Star recommendation was administratively closed after Fallujah, Sarah said. The flatness of a fact carried so long it had worn smooth. Official language said lost in transition. I found the letter 5 years after he died. A pause. I always assumed it was bureaucratic failure. The chaos of a complex operation, she looked at the rifle case she was still holding. I never assumed it was anything else. Drummond looked at her for a long moment. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be harder. She walked back to her room, set the ammunition case beside her rifle, sat on the cot, picked up the M24 and held it across her lap the way she had in 1,000 rooms in a dozen countries. A hairline crack in the stock caught the light. She ran her thumb along it, felt the repair. The careful work of linseed oil and patience. Repaired things are often stronger at the break than they were before. She thought about Voss, on a device he wasn't supposed to have, calling someone, planning something, she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of anger, her father's rule. 30 seconds to be human about things that aren't fair, then you get back to work. She was back to work before the 30 seconds were up. She lay down, closed her eyes, slept. Day 3 morning, Sarah went to her desk. The printed phase schedule, distributed by Pruitt's office on day 1, left in the same position she left everything, was gone, not misplaced. Gone. Surface beneath it was clean in the specific way of surfaces that have been deliberately tidied. Someone had come into her room while she slept, taken one piece of paper, left everything else untouched. One piece of paper. She stood in the middle of her room and did the math. They had a key, they'd used it twice, and they were escalating. Ammunition was logistics, replaceable. Schedule was intelligence. Not knowing today's phases in a competition that changed without public announcement meant showing up to the wrong range at the wrong time. Disqualification automatic. No appeal. Clean. Deniable. The rulebook weaponized. She got dressed in 4 minutes. Knocked on Drummond's door. Same pattern as 2 nights ago. He opened it immediately. Already dressed. She looked at him. When did you start expecting this? When Voss closed that door too carefully on day 1, he turned back into the room, picked up a spare schedule from inside his jacket hanging on the chair back, held it out. I made 2 copies last night. Kept one on my person. She took it. The stress fire phase had been moved from 1400 to 1100. A change not announced publicly. Only competitors who had read the update sheet the previous night would know. If I hadn't come to you, she said, you'd have shown up at 1400 to an empty range. His jaw moved once. Automatic disqualification. Competitor failed to report to assigned phase. The coldness of it settled into the room between them. Not violence, not confrontation. Just the clean precision of someone who understood the rules well enough to make them hurt. He's done this before, Sarah said. Not a question. 6 years ago, Drummond said it carefully, measuring each word. A ranger named Keisha Torrance, leading her bracket going into day 3, disqualified for missing a phase schedule discrepancy. Nobody could prove anything. He paused. Voss was at that tournament too. Sarah pressed the schedule flat, put it in her chest pocket. Buttoned it. Thank you, don't thank me. Same words he always used. Just shoot. She shot. The stress fire phase, 400 meters of obstacles with full kit and a 20-pound vest, heart rate elevated. Muscles burning, 8 seconds at the end to acquire and fire a single shot at 600 yards. Was designed to replicate combat conditions, because in combat you were never calm, never perfectly positioned, never given the luxury of clean conditions. Sarah came off the final obstacle breathing hard. Left knee sending its familiar signal, not pain, reminder, don't forget me. She didn't forget. She found the firing position. 1 shot. 8 second at 600, front post, rear aperture. Father's voice in the back of her chest, you are the instrument. The rifle is the tool. She fired on second 5, dead center. The scoring officer said, center. Then, because apparently he couldn't help it, perfect center. The competitors watching from the recovery area went very quiet. Then one of them, a SEAL from the West Coast team who had been in Voss's orbit since day 1, said audibly to the man beside him, that's the best shot I've ever seen on this course. Ran in the 3rd group. She could see it from the recovery area, the sharp, uncontrolled breathing of a man trying to perform beyond his current state of agitation. He fired at second 3, too early. Before the breath settled, 7. He knew before the score came back. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. The particular stillness of a man absorbing something he'd known was coming and still wasn't ready for. He turned for the first time since the competition began. He looked directly at her across the recovery area. Not with contempt, not with the calculated dismissal of the previous 2 days, with something rawer than either of those. Something that in another person, in a better moment, might have developed into understanding. It didn't, it hardened. He looked away. Chief Pruitt found her at the equipment staging area at 0945. His expression was different. Not the professional neutrality of the first 2 days. Something that had broken the surface. Real concern. The kind that pulls at a man's face when he's deciding whether what he knows is something he's supposed to say. Captain Callum. He looked at her locker. Back at her. I need to ask you something. Think carefully before you answer, all right? Has anything interfered with your equipment or your access to competition materials since you arrived? She held his gaze. Why are you asking me this right now? He exhaled through his nose. Because I found something this morning. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a key. Her locker number engraved on the grip. He held it so she could see. This was in the lock of the logistics cabinet, he said. Not your locker. The main storage cabinet, the one only logistics staff have access to. He paused. Someone used your key to access your locker and then stored it where they thought it wouldn't be found. The silence between them was specific. I'm not asking you to file a formal complaint right now, he said. I'm asking you to confirm what I already believe happened, so I know how to handle the next 24 hours. Someone took 40 rounds from my locker 2 nights ago, Sarah said, and my training schedule was taken from my room the following night. Pruitt's expression did something complicated. The kind of complicated that happens to men who have served honorably for a long time and suddenly find themselves inside something that dishonors the institution they spent their career building. Do you know who? I have a strong indication. I don't have proof, he nodded slowly. Put the key back in his pocket. I'm going to handle this through channels that won't tip off whoever is responsible. He met her eyes. Your schedule is confirmed. The 1100 phase proceeds. Nobody is running another disappearing act on my range. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Chief. Don't thank me, he said it the same way Drummond always said it. Almost the same words. She noticed that both men said it the same way, and understood something about the kind of people who show up when something actually needs to be done. Just show up at 1100, he said. She did. The afternoon scores posted at 1300. Sarah first on the board, Voss fourth, and the gap between those positions had become 3 aces. Not a matter of points, but of something more fundamental. The numbers reflected it but didn't explain it, because numbers show results. What she was doing was something that produced results the way a river produces water, the natural output of something deeper and older and more fundamental than any single measurement. That evening, Drummond knocked on her door. She opened it. His face told her before his words did. Voss pulled 2 junior SEALs out of this afternoon's free practice window, he said. Spoke to them privately for about 10 minutes. Who? He told her. 2 names she recognized. Junior operators who had been consistent in their deference to Voss since day one. Not friends, followers. A different and more concerning category. What's tomorrow's phase? Garza hasn't announced it officially. He paused. But based on the range setup I walked through this morning, long precision series, cold bore, 5 shots. Distenses called it position. She thought about that. No pre-calculation. Real-time adaptation. Format that most favored shooters who could think in the moment rather than dial in a solution beforehand. Which was, she recognized, the format that most favored iron sights over electronics. Which Voss would also recognize. You think he's planning something for tomorrow. I think he's planning something. Whether it's tomorrow or before, I don't know. But he pulled those 2 men privately. He was careful about who could see him do it. She looked through her window at the range. Targets still hanging. Wind flags. All the honest, measurable facts of a competition someone was trying to corrupt from inside. Then we'll be ready. What does ready look like? Shooting better than I've ever shot in my life, she said, and letting whoever needs to handle the rest of it do their job. He was quiet for a moment. Then, and this was the thing she had been waiting for, the thing she could feel gathering since the first morning when he said her father's name. I need to tell you something I should have told you on day 1. She waited. Fallujah, he said. November 2004. I wasn't in your father's unit. 2 blocks east with a different element. He stopped. Started again more carefully. Combat radio doesn't respect unit boundaries, especially in a city fight. Especially when something is happening that nobody has a playbook for. Very still. There was a sniper. Marine. Holding a position on a 3-story building on the eastern approach. The building was on fire. Had been for one man. Stayed in that position and kept firing. He paused for 4 hours. While the building burned around him, Sarah didn't speak. 17 men walked out of that corridor because of 1 rifle, Drummond said. 1 man who refused to move. He paused again. Longer this time. I heard it on the radio. Real time. Different element calling it in. They kept saying there's a Marine up there. He won't come down. He's still firing. He stopped. I tried to find his name after. I never found it in any official document. 17. Father had come home from that November and sat across a Montana kitchen table from her for 14 more years and never said that number. Had talked about the weather, rifle conditions, early season cold snaps, taught her to read wind and trust iron and make the shot that needed to happen regardless of conditions, and had never said. I kept 17 men alive and nobody wrote it down right, had never said anything. He never talked about it, she said. No. Drummond's voice was careful. Men who do what he did, the real ones, they almost never do. She looked at her father's foe leaning against the wall, the hairline crack. the repair, the linseed oil, and patience of a man who believed broken things were worth keeping. A man who had stayed in a burning building for 4 hours and come home and taught his daughter everything he knew, and never once suggested that the military owed him a single thing for any of it. 17 men. She found out the rest the next morning, not from a conversation. From a piece of paper. Drummond had pulled the thread weeks before arriving at China Lake. Had suspected something. Had requested records from the National Personnel Records Center through channels he didn't explain. Had been waiting until she was ready to hear it, or until the thread led somewhere he could actually use. It had led somewhere. Silver Star recommendation for Staff Sergeant Daniel James Callum had been submitted January 14, 2005, 2 months after Operation Phantom Fury. Filed by his commanding officer, Captain Richard Norse. Filed correctly, filed completely. Received February 2, 2005. Received. Read. Set aside the notation in the administrative record, insufficient independent corroboration from officers of sufficient rank. Sarah read it twice. Then she looked up from the paper. What does the rest say? Drummond pulled out a second page, an internal memo. The kind not meant to leave the building it was written in. He'd gotten it from a source she didn't ask him to name. He put it on the cot beside her. She read it. Daniel Callum had filed a formal report on December 19, 2004, 3 weeks after Phantom Fury. A report about a senior lieutenant in his brigade who had been systematically misreporting ammunition expenditure, inflating requisitions, redirecting the difference. In a garrison environment, it might go unnoticed for years. In a combat zone, it was the kind of thing that got men killed when supplies that should have been there weren't. Daniel had filed the report. The lieutenant he'd reported had a relationship with the officer who controlled Silver Star approvals in that brigade. The recommendation had been set aside 3 weeks after the report was filed. Coincidence was a word. Sarah had stopped believing in it professionally around her second deployment. She sat with the paper on her lap and said nothing for a long time. Not because she was in shock. She was the daughter of a man who had taught her to read the wind. Sometimes the wind told you exactly what you didn't want to hear, and your job was to receive that information clearly and not let it compromise the shot. But this was not the range, and this was her father. Father hadn't been forgotten by a failing system. He had been deliberately set aside by a system protecting itself, because he'd told the truth, because done the right thing, and the right thing had cost him everything the military owed him. He set the paper down, looked at the M224, said very quietly to the room, the weapon who had carried it through a burning building in Fallujah and come home and never asked for anything. Iron doesn't lie. A pause. Shows you exactly what's there. Another pause. Nothing more. Nothing less. Drummond said nothing for a long moment, then carefully, "That's what we need to show them." It arrived at 0300 on day 4. Sarah heard it before she felt it. A sound like a freight train changing its mind about its direction, coming from the west, and arriving fast enough that the first gust hit the barracks wall while she was still sitting up from sleep. Then the rain not building gradually, arriving all at once, the way serious Pacific storms arrived when they meant it. Full force from the first second, horizontal, driven by a wind Pruitt would later measure at sustained 42 miles per hour with gusts to 61. She was dressed and at the window in 90 seconds. The range was invisible, not obscured, invisible. The kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as occupy, filling every space between objects until distance becomes theoretical. Target frames at 200 yards were shapes. At 400 they were suggestions. Anything beyond that was nothing at all. She picked up her father's rifle, checked the iron sights by feel, which she could do in complete darkness, which she had done in complete darkness more times than she could count, in places where darkness was not a training condition, but a survival condition. The sights were there. Ivan doesn't care about weather. That was the thing people with expensive electronics forgot until conditions reminded them. Electronic systems had operating parameters. Water found every seal eventually. Batteries failed in cold. Digital interfaces frosted and flickered and gave readings that were worse than no reading at all, because a wrong number was more dangerous than an honest blank. Her phone buzzed. Pruitt's office. All competitors. Competition continues per standing protocol. All phases proceed unless safety threshold exceeded. Report to main briefing at 060. She read it twice. Every other competitor in this tournament had optics that would be compromised by the storm. High-end glass fogged under rapid temperature and humidity changes. Electronic ballistic computers had operating parameters. Laser rangefinders had operating parameters. Everything had operating parameters. And the storm was currently exceeding all of them. Sarah had iron sights. Iron sights had one weakness. The shooter had to see the target in this visibility. Seeing beyond 300 yards was going to require something technology couldn't provide and couldn't replace. It was going to require knowing the wind without measuring it, knowing the distance without calculating it, knowing the shot without confirming it, the specific accumulated knowledge of 20 years of training in conditions exactly like this, in Montana winters that didn't apologize. Father who had said to Ed, she could hear him saying it now. The best time to learn to shoot is when you can't see, because that's when you find out whether you actually know it, or whether you've just been reading the instruments. She had learned to shoot when she couldn't see. The 0600 briefing held 40 competitors and one empty chair. The chair belonged to a SEAL from the East Coast team who had formally withdrawn 20 minutes earlier. Primary scope had shorted in the rain, backup fogged irreparably. His decision to withdraw was the most honest thing anyone in this room had done in 4 days. Pruitt stood at the front. He looked like a man who had been awake since the storm arrived and had used the hours productively. Storm forecast to continue through 1800, he said. Winds sustained at 35 to 45. Gusting to 60. Day 4 phases proceed. A pause. Competitors who cannot perform under current conditions are encouraged to withdraw now. Withdrawal now is weather withdrawal. Withdrawal during a phase is performance failure. The room did the math quietly. One more thing, Pruitt said, almost as an afterthought. Except nothing Pruitt said was an afterthought. Admiral Stokes has invoked his authority as senior tournament officer to add one unannounced extreme condition precision challenge today. Details at the range. Be there at 800. 5 competitors withdrew before the first shot was fired, quickly, professionally, with the dignity of men who understood their limits and respected them. Sarah watched them go without judgment. Limits were honest things. She went to her lane in rain that immediately soaked through her base layer and found its way into every space between fabric and skin. Cold, Montana cold. The kind that felt like the weather was conducting an audit of your commitment. She found the first target through her iron sights at 600 yards. A shape in gray rain. Read the wind. 40 miles per hour sustained with a gust pattern that peaked every 8 to 12 seconds then dropped. She needed to fire in the trough between gusts. Needed to give the crosswind enough lead to account for the bullet's flight time in this air. She waited, felt the gust peak, felt it begin to drop, fired. Hit came the radio call. Second target, 800 yards. The calculation changed with distance in ways that weren't linear. Wind drift at 800 yards in these conditions was a different animal with its own behavior and its own demands. She fired in the gust trough, hit third target, 1,000 yards. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, not to rest them, to reset her perception, to let go of the instinct to see and find the instinct to know. Father had taught her this technique on a night when the Montana fog was so thick she couldn't see her hand at arm's length. Stop looking. Start feeling. The wind tells you where things are if you know how to listen. She listened. The wind was telling her specific things about distance and position and drift. Not in words, in the language of pressure and angle. She assembled these facts below conscious thought. She fired. The radio was silent for 4 seconds. Hit dead center. The observation deck erupted. Not cheering, not applause. The involuntary vocalization of people watching something that was reordering their understanding of what was possible. Admiral Stokes lowered his binoculars, said something to the man beside him. The man beside him picked up a radio. Sarah was already repositioning for the next target. She hit it, and the one after that, and every target Pruitt had placed on that range in a Pacific storm, with sustained 40-mile-per-hour crosswinds and visibility that had defeated 3 of the most advanced sniper platforms in the American military arsenal in the past hour. When she stood and cleared her weapon at the end of the phase, Pruitt walked to her lane and stood there for a long moment, looked at her card, looked at the rain, looked back at her card. 12 for 12, he said, very quietly. In this, upstairs on the observation deck, Admiral Harlan Stokes picked up his command phone, the one with full service, the one that reached Naval Personnel Command directly, and walked to the back of the observation position, and made a call in the rain, while she stood below and cleaned her weapon in a downpour that had defeated everyone else. That evening Voss sat alone, tablet on his knees, competition board on the screen, her name at the top, his name at 4th. The gap between those numbers was 23 points. He hadn't closed it with the broken scope. Hadn't closed it with 40 missing rounds. Hadn't closed it with a training schedule that disappeared from a locked room in the middle of the night. Hadn't closed it with 2 junior operators willing to do what he asked. Hadn't closed it with equipment that cost more than most people's cars and had shorted in the rain while iron sights continued to function, because iron sights had no components that weather could reach. 12 points. He didn't pick up the phone. For the first time in 4 days, he just sat with the board and the numbers and the specific honest silence of a man who has run out of options and is discovering what, if anything, is left underneath. His jaw moved once, that was all. He closed the tablet, and for the first time since Sarah Callum had stepped off that bus with her father's rifle and her left leg that didn't quite match, and her iron sights and her complete infuriating calm, Decker Voss did nothing. The nothing was somehow the most significant thing he'd done all week. Sarah was in her room with her father's rifle across her lap, running a clean patch through the bore and holding it up to the window light. The patch came back clean. It was always clean. That was what happened when you cared for something every single day without exception. She thought about the memo, about her father coming home, sitting at the kitchen table. Never saying 17, never saying 4 hours, never saying the building was on fire and I stayed because that was the job and the job was worth doing right. Just teaching her morning after morning. Cold after cold, everything he knew, iron doesn't lie, she said very quietly to the dark room. She hadn't known, when she first said it this week, that she was saying his words. She didn't know yet that she'd been saying them her whole life. She would find that out tomorrow. And it would break her open, in the best way. The only way anything real ever gets broken open. Day 5 arrived the way serious things always arrive. Without apology, the storm had moved east overnight and left behind the specific clarity that follows serious weather. Air scoured of everything uncertain. Sky that had made its decision and committed to it. The desert at China Lake in the hour before dawn, looking like the world had been reset to its original settings. Sarah was awake at 0430, dressed by 435, sitting on the edge of her cot with her father's rifle across her lap by 040, doing nothing in particular except being present with the weight of it. She didn't rehearse, didn't visualize phases or run scenarios. Her father had built something more durable than technique into the foundation of who she was. She just sat and remembered. Knock at 0530, not Drummond's knock. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move, rifle in hand, body between the door and window. Threat response so deeply wired it happened before thought. Then she saw who it was and let the rifle drop to her side. Pruitt, and behind him 2 men in civilian clothes with the specific carriage of people who were not actually civilians. The way they stood, the way their eyes moved, military investigators. Captain Callum. Pruitt's voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, not the professional neutrality of the range, something tighter, something that had been under pressure for hours and was now carefully, deliberately, being released. I need 5 minutes. She stepped back. They came in last night, Pruitt said. We completed an investigation Commander Reeves authorized on day 2. He stopped, collected himself the way honest men collect themselves before delivering something they've been carrying. I want to tell you what we found before the morning briefing, because you deserve to hear it first. She waited. Lieutenant Commander Voss was in contact with Major Gerald Haas from the tournament's Administrative Oversight Office. Haas controls equipment assignments and facility access. Pruitt's jaw tightened. The broken scope on day 1. Haas, your locker access. Haas, schedule taken from your room. One of 2 junior SEALs Voss recruited. He paused. We have communication records, the key log, and a witness statement. He stopped. One of the junior SEALs came forward last night. Voluntarily. Nobody called him in. Something moved through Pruitt's expression. Not quite relief. The more complicated thing that comes after carrying a weight too long and finally setting it down, he said, and I'm quoting, I watched her shoot in that storm and I kept thinking, what are we actually protecting? What did we do? The room was quiet. What happens now? Sarah said. Voss and Haas are under investigation. Confined to quarters pending review. Pruitt looked at her with the expression of a man who has done a hard thing and feels no satisfaction about it. Only the grim relief of completion. The competition proceeds. Your scores stand. All of them. A pause. Voss has been told he can attend the awards ceremony tonight if he chooses. She nodded. I should have caught it sooner, Pruitt said. Plainly, without the careful hedge of a man protecting himself from accountability. That's something I'll carry. Then he left. Sarah sat back down on the cot. She thought about Voss, not with satisfaction, not with anger, with something more complicated than either, the feeling that accompanies watching someone make a choice so wrong it consumed the genuine skill underneath it. Because he was genuinely skilled. She'd watched him shoot for 4 days, one of the best technical marksmen she'd encountered in competition. He had built something real and used it in service of something small, and the small thing had destroyed the real thing. She picked up her father's rifle and ran her thumb along the hairline crack. 2 kinds of people in every room. The ones who, when they encounter something better than them, try to destroy it, and the ones who try to understand it. The difference between those 2 choices was the difference between a career that ended in an investigation and a career that ended in something worth remembering. She stood up. There was still a final day to shoot. 1300 she went to the equipment area to prepare for the championship challenge and found Admiral Stokes waiting, not Pruitt, Stokes himself. Which meant this was not a logistics conversation. He was holding a folder sealed, stamped with the Naval Personnel Command seal. "This came through this morning," he said. He held it out. "I want you to read it before the final phase." She took it, opened it. The letter was an official notification. The language of military bureaucracy. Formal, careful, containing human content inside institutional structure. Review initiation for the Silver Star recommendation of Staff Sergeant Daniel James Callum. Submitted January 14, 2005, regarding actions during Operation Phantom Fury, Fallujah, Republic of Iraq, November 7 through November 14, 2004. The review had been initiated at the request of Admiral Harlan Stokes. Expected timeline for completion, 30 days. The letter noted that based on documentation reviewed, the board considered confirmation of the award. She read this part twice, highly probable. She read it a 3rd time. Her eyes moved over her father's name. His full name, Daniel James Callum, Staff Sergeant, USMC. The name she had known her entire life, attached now to the thing he had earned and never received. The acknowledgement that should have come home with him in 2005 and hadn't, that was now 20 years late, imperfect in its lateness, but real and documented and moving through official channels with an admiral's name on it. Finally arriving, she looked up at Stokes. For only the 2nd time this entire week, in a room with another person, she felt the pressure in her chest that meant grief and pride had found each other, and were occupying the same space at the same time. "He deserved this in 2005, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Yes," Stokes said. "He did. He never talked about the Silver Star. He never complained about it." She stopped. "He just kept teaching me. Spent years teaching me everything he knew, without ever once suggesting that the military hadn't given him what he'd earned." Stokes looked at her for a moment. "That," he said quietly, "is the definition of character." She folded the letter carefully, put it in her chest pocket, buttoned it over her heart. "Go shoots," Stokes said, his voice carrying the quality of a man who has more to say and is choosing to say it differently, through presence rather than words. "He's watching." She picked up her rifle and walked to the range. The championship challenge was announced at 1400. Commander Reeves described it to the 38 remaining competitors, and the room did the thing rooms do when they encounter something that redefines the scale of what they thought they were dealing with. It went very still. Stillness became its own kind of answer, cumulative fire, 11 shots at escalating distances, starting at 400 yards, moving back 100 yards for each subsequent shot. No reset between distances, no recalibration. Ending at 400 yards, 1 shot at 400 yards, at 400 yards with a standard rifle and quality optic in good conditions, a world-class marksman had perhaps a 40% chance of a first-round hit. The variables at that distance compounded on each other. Wind drift, bullet drop, atmospheric density, the inherent accuracy limits of the ammunition itself, until the shot became as much art as physics. With iron sights, the mathematics moved into territory that most of the room, without saying it out loud, classified as practically impossible. Sarah heard the challenge described, heard the final distance called, and thought about her father in the rain in Fallujah, firing through smoke at targets he couldn't fully see. This is where the physics said no and he said yes anyway, because 17 men were counting on him to find a way. 400 yards was not impossible. 400 yards was a number. Numbers didn't win, people did. She went to lane 7. Same lane as day 1. She had stopped wondering if that was coincidence. She went prone. Cleared her mind the way she cleared a chamber, deliberately, completely, until what remained was only what was necessary. 400 yards, Montana. Early morning. She is 7 years old. Father's hands close over hers on the stock, positioning her grip with the patience of someone who understands that patience is not a delay but a delivery system. Feel it before you think it, he says. Cold grass under her knees, cold air in her lungs. Front post finding the target with the specific certainty of something clicking into place. She fires. 500 yards. She doesn't check the score. Doesn't need to. She already knows Kenter's 600 yards. Wind 12 miles per hour left to right. Consistent. She read it 20 minutes ago. At 600 yards, that wind means approximately 8 inches of drift over the bullet's flight time. She adjusts without a turret, without a dial, without anything except the position of the front post relative to where she knows the target is. Someone on the observation deck exhales loudly enough that she can hear it above her 700 yards. The day her father came home from Fallujah. She is 8 years old. She doesn't know yet what Fallujah is. She knows only that he has been gone for 7 months, and now he is standing in the doorway of their Montana house with his duffel bag and his rifle case and his eyes that look like her father's eyes, but are also somehow different, containing something new, something she won't have a name for until she is much older. He crosses the room and picks her up and holds her. He doesn't say anything. She realizes years later that he was shaking. She fires at 700 yards, counterpoint, 800 yards. The observation deck has been filling steadily since the 400-yard shot. Men arriving from other parts of Zace, drawn by the current that draws people toward things they sense, are historic without being told that's what they are. She doesn't look up. Fires. Center point 900 yards. Okafor stopped calling scores out loud somewhere around 700. He is just writing them down now with the concentrated silence of a man who has run out of words and decided to stop looking for them. Point 1,000 yards. Kandahar. 2019. She is 23. The surgeon is looking at her left knee with an expression she has learned to read. She stops him before he can say what he's going to say. Tell me what I can still do, he blinks. He tells her. She does all of it, every single thing on the list, plus some things that weren't on the list. Because the list was his estimate, and estimates are based on averages. She has never been an average canter. The range has gone completely silent. Not gradually. Crossed a threshold somewhere around 900 yards, and the silence became absolute. 38 competitors and an observation deck full of military personnel, all holding their breath simultaneously without coordinating it. 1,100 yards. She breathes, feels the wind, feels the distance in her bones, the way distances she's shot her entire life live in her body as physical memory rather than intellectual data. Fires Condor. 200 yards. Yesterday's distance. The one that stopped the range cold in the middle of a Pacific storm. Today the conditions are cleaner. Her body already knows what 2,100 yards requires because yesterday has been filed in the same place everything gets filed. Below conscious thought. In the foundation her father built Kentra 3 a yard, so she is aware of something she has never felt in competition before. Not nervousness, not pressure. The specific quality of a moment recognizing itself. The sense that the last 20 years of her life have been the preparation for the next 90 seconds. That somewhere the accounting is about to be settled. She fires 4 seconds of radio sustain. 4 seconds that the observation deck will describe for years. Hit, the scoring officer says, 300 yards. Center. The sound from the deck is not polite, not organized. The completely involuntary noise of multiple people failing simultaneously to maintain composure. Burst that lasts 3 seconds and then cuts off as they remember where they are. The cutting off is somehow louder than the noise itself. 1,400 yards. She repositions the final distance. The distance that the math says is the edge of possibility, and that she is going to shoot anyway, because her father did not spend 20 years teaching her to respect mathematical limits. He spent 20 years teaching her that the limits were where the work began. She goes through her process, not slowly. At the speed the shot requires, she feels the wind. 12 miles per hour, left to right, consistent. The same wind she has been reading since she arrived on this lane. She feels the distance, the 400 yards between her and a dark target she cannot see clearly, but can locate the way she locates everything. Through the accumulated knowledge of mornings and cold, and a man's patient hands and the honest simplicity of iron that doesn't add anything and doesn't take anything away. She feels the front post, the rear aperture, the alignment between them. She feels her father's hands over hers. One last time, in the Montana dark, before the world was awake, before she understood what she was being given, before she knew that every single morning of her childhood It was a gift being placed in her hands by a man who had survived something terrible and come home and decided the most important thing he could do with what he'd learned was give it to her. She breathes out. In the pause between breaths, when the body is briefly still enough to be trusted, she breaks the trigger. The bullet travels for approximately 1.8 seconds. During those 1.8 seconds, the range is so quiet that Admiral Stokes, standing at the observation railing, will say later he could hear his own heartbeat. Then the radio crackles, and the scoring officer at 400 yards says 3 words: hit dead center. What happens next is not the response of a professional military audience at a controlled competition. What happens next is the response of human beings who have just watched something they will describe for the rest of their lives. The observation deck erupts without restraint. Men who have spent careers learning to control their reactions, discovering that this particular moment exceeds the capacity of their training to contain. Voices calling out in genuine unguarded amazement. Admiral Stokes grips the railing with both hands. Somewhere in the middle of it says to no one in particular, in the voice of a man who has lost the battle to remain neutral, "My God." Reeves didn't say anything. She stood at the railing and looked at the range below, where Sarah Callum was clearing her weapon and standing and becoming aware of the sound above her. And she felt something that a person who has spent 30 years in the company of exceptional soldiers feels rarely enough to notice when it arrives. Privileged to have been present, to have seen it. She turned to the officer beside her. "Get the ceremony room ready," she said. "Tonight, full dress." Every branch present, Sarah walked off the range and found Drummond waiting. His face was the most open she'd seen it in 5 days. The careful reserve of a 22-year veteran completely set aside, placed by the expression of a man who has watched something he will never forget and is not trying to pretend otherwise. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her. She looked back. 9 for 12 yesterday, she said. In a hurricane. That was real shooting. He shook his head. Slowly. "Don't do that, Elias." It was 400 yards, he stopped, with iron sights. Dead center. "After everything this week threw at you," he paused. "There are maybe 5 people alive who could do what you just did, and I don't know that any of them could do it on that rifle. With that equipment." After everything, she was quiet for a moment. "My father could have done it," she said. "In November 2004, in the rain in Fallujah, he did things that were harder." She paused. "I'm just the proof that he taught it right." Drummond looked at her for a long moment. "He did," he said very quietly, and that was the most complete sentence she had heard all week. The ceremony was held at 1900 in the base's formal assembly room, every available chair filled, men standing along the walls. Word had traveled the way it travels on military bases, not through official channels, but through the human ones, person to person, the story moving and growing until every person in that room had heard a version of it and come to see the ending for themselves. Sarah stood at the front in full dress uniform, her father's rifle in her hands. She had insisted on holding it. Pruitt had started to say something about ceremony protocol and stopped himself because some arguments answer themselves before they're finished. Commander Reeves stood before the assembled group. Admiral Stokes to her right. The room in that particular silence of people who are already inside whatever is about to happen, rather than waiting for it. Reeves spoke without notes. 5 days ago, she said, stood on an observation deck and watched a woman put iron sights on a rifle that had been to Fallujah and back and make shots that the best-equipped platforms in our arsenal could not replicate in the worst conditions this has seen in a decade. She paused. "I've been in this work for 30 years. I've trained with the best marksmen this country has produced. I thought I understood what the ceiling looked like." Another pause. "I was wrong." The room said nothing. "But this week wasn't about shooting. Shooting is wadu. This week was about what produces shooting. Real shooting, the kind that functions when everything else has failed, is character. Discipline. Legacy." She stopped. "And love. The love of a father for a daughter, and a daughter for a father, and both of them for a craft that deserved to be handed down." She turned to Admiral Stokes forward, holding a folder. "Official. Stamped. Signed the initiation order." Stokes opened it so the room could see. "Staff Sergeant Daniel James Callum," he said, and the name landed in the room with the weight of 20 years of waiting behind it. "Was recommended for the Silver Star in January 2005 for actions during Operation Phantom Fury that preserved the lives of 17 United States servicemen." He paused. "That recommendation was administratively delayed and never completed. That failure belongs to the institution." Not to him, he looked at Sarah. The Silver Star itself will be formally presented upon completion of the review process, 30 days from today. Tonight I am signing the initiation order before this assembled company. Another pause. This man waited 20 years for paperwork that should have taken 20 days. I'm not adding another hour I can control. He signed it, in front of everyone. The scratch of his pen in complete silence. Come forward, Captain. She stepped forward. Her left leg carried her without hesitation. Her eyes were dry. Her hands were steady. Rifle in her left hand. Right hand extended. Stokes placed the signed order in her right hand. She looked at it, her father's name on official letterhead, his rank. The actions cited. The words highly probable in the measured language of institutional certainty. The acknowledgement that should have come home with him in 2005, and hadn't, that was now, 20 years late, imperfect in its lateness, but real and documented and moving through official channels with an admiral's signature. Finally arriving, she felt him in the room not as fantasy, not as grief's invention, as the quality of presence that people leave behind in the things they've touched and taught and loved. He was in the rifle in her left hand. He was in the paper in her right. He was in every shot she had made this week and every morning that had preceded every shot and every lesson that had produced every morning. She looked up at the room, 38 competitors. Every branch of the military, range staff, investigators. Pruitt standing very straight and looking at a fixed point on the wall, the way men look when they're keeping their faces from doing something. Okafor, who had stopped trying to keep his face from doing anything and was simply letting it. Drummond at the back of the room, arms folded, jaw working, not quite succeeding at composure and not particularly trying to. And in the front row, Decker Voss standing with the others, hands at his sides, back straight. He had chosen to come. That choosing mattered. Even though it wasn't enough, even though it didn't undo what he'd done, even though the path from here to anything resembling redemption was long and uncertain and entirely his responsibility to walk. He had chosen to be in this room. That was something. Their eyes met. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Not forgiveness, that was a longer conversation in a more private place. Not endorsement, just acknowledgement that he was there, that he had chosen to be there. He nodded back, looked at the floor. Reeves raised her voice one final time. This week proved something I think we needed to be reminded of, she said. We live in a time when we trust our equipment more than ourselves. When we believe that better tools produce better warriors. When we've started to confuse technical capability with the thing that actually wins. She paused. Captain Callum reminded us this week that machines may change the nature of war, but warriors still win it. She looked at Sarah. And warriors are made by people like the man whose rifle she carried into this room. Then, and this was the thing Reeves had been holding, saving for last. For after everything else had been said, so it would land in the only way it deserved to land. Before we close tonight, she said, I want to share something found in Staff Sergeant Callum's service file. A personal journal entry, written November 14, 2004. The last day of Operation Phantom Fury, the room held absolutely still. Reeves looked at the paper in her hand. He wrote, Iron doesn't lie. It shows you exactly what's there. Nothing more, nothing less. That's the whole job. That's always been the whole job. This was silent for a long time. Sarah didn't move. Couldn't. Iron doesn't lie. She had said that to Drummond on day one. Said it to herself in the armory when she removed the broken scope. Said it to the range and the targets in the storm and the dark. Said it to her father's rifle every morning of this week when she checked the iron sights by feel in the pre-dawn dark. Had been saying it her entire life. She hadn't known she was saying his words. She hadn't known he'd written them down. He had taught her everything. Had handed her this phrase the way he handed her everything else. Quietly, without announcement, without saying this is important, remember this, just saying it, morning after morning, cold after cold, until it became the structure of how she thought, until she couldn't tell where his voice ended and her own began, until she carried him so completely inside herself that she spoke his words without knowing they were his. He had given her everything, without credit, without recognition, without the silver star that should have been his and wasn't. Without anyone writing down what he'd done in that building in Fallujah. He had come home and sat across a Montana kitchen table and given her every single thing he knew, because it was right, because she was his, because the knowledge deserved to survive. Her eyes, dry for 5 full days, through sabotage and storms and 400 yards of desert and the names of 17 men she hadn't known existed. Filled, she let them, just for a moment, just for him, Just for the man who had stayed in a burning building because the job was worth doing right, and come home and never said a word about it to anyone, and taught his daughter everything anyway. The room rose, not as a coordinated response, not on a signal. Each person rising when they arrived at the same conclusion through their own route, and they arrived at it in a wave that moved from front to back, chair by chair, until every person in the room was standing, and the sound they made together was not applause. It was sustained, collective, genuine, the sound of people honoring something real, something that had waited a long time to be honored and had arrived here tonight through 20 years of Montana mornings. And one young woman who refused to put down a rifle that the world had given her every reason to put down. Sarah stood at the front of it, paper in one hand, rifle in the other, and let the sound move through her without trying to contain it or perform a response to it. She pressed the signed order against her chest, felt him standing behind her, hand on her shoulder. The way it had been in Montana at 5 in the morning with frost on the grass, and the rifle between them and all the lessons still ahead. All the mornings they still had. All the things he hadn't said yet that he would say quietly, over years, without ever announcing that he was saying them. She had carried him into this room. And the room had finally, 20 years late, imperfectly, inadequately late but real, said his name in the right place. Later she walked out into the California night alone. She had chosen alone. The desert was cool after the storm. Stars visible now that the clouds had moved east. The base quiet with the specific quiet of a place that has processed something large and is still settling around it. She walked to the edge of the range. Stood at the firing line of Lane 7. Looked out at 400 yards of dark desert. Targets were still out there. Somewhere, at the far end of the distance she had covered with iron and breath, and her father's voice and 22 years of Montana mornings, and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had been told in 100 different ways what she couldn't do, and had found every single time that she could. Rifle on her right shoulder, the initiation order in her left chest pocket, buttoned over her heart. Her left leg was tired. The specific tired that came after days of demanding more of it than it technically wanted to give. Kind of tired she had learned to respect without obeying. The kind that said, "I'm here," without saying stop. She didn't stop. She looked up at the sky for a moment. Not praying, not performing grief, just looking. The way you look at something vast when you want the vastness to know you're there. When you want the distance between where you are and where someone you love has gone to feel, just briefly, slightly smaller. I got it, she thought. Not in words exactly. In the feeling underneath words, I got it for you. 30 days and your name will be on the right list, in the right file. Where it should have been 20 years ago, you taught me right. Every single morning, you taught me right. She breathed the desert air, cool and clean after the storm. Took one more look at the distance, then she turned and walked back toward the barracks, her left leg carrying her the way it always had. Slightly different from her right, a rhythm that was hers, specific. Earned her father's rifle on her shoulder, his words in her chest, his name, finally, irrevocably moving toward the right place in her pocket. She walked at exactly the pace she intended to walk, not faster, not slower, her pace. The pace he had built, morning by morning, cold by cold, shot by shot, until she became the thing he had always known she would be, the proof that he had taught it right. That iron doesn't lie, that it shows you exactly what's there, nothing more, nothing less. The whole job, always the whole job, the last iron sight. Hooky grabbed the rifle from her hands and slammed it onto the concrete floor. The crack of old wood echoed across the entire armory. "Take your daddy's relic back to a museum," he said, loud enough for every man in the room to hear. "This is a SEAL competition, not a history class." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. She looked down at her father's rifle, the rifle that had survived a burning building in Fallujah, that had outlasted a war, that had been carried home and cleaned every single morning for 14 years by a man who never told anyone what he'd done with it. Now lying on concrete, scratched, humiliated. Then she looked up at him and smiled. That smile terrified him more than anything he had ever seen in combat. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that her father had kept 17 men alive with that rifle, and the medal he earned for it had been buried, on purpose, by the same kind of men who were now stealing her ammunition in the dark, sabotaging her scope, erasing her name from the schedule. They thought a broken rifle and an old set of iron sights would be enough to break her. They were about to learn what 20 years of Montana mornings had built, and what a dead man's voice still says every time she breathes out.